The gates of Rome stand open. For the first time in 8 centuries, barbarian warriors pour through the streets of the Eternal City, their war cries echoing off marble temples that have stood since before Christ walked the earth. The year is 410 AD, and the impossible is happening. Rome, invincible Rome, eternal Rome, the city that conquered the known world, is burning. And the men setting those fires? They're Goths, Germanic tribesmen who just decades ago were desperate refugees begging for sanctuary at the empire's borders. But this story doesn't start here. It starts 3 centuries earlier in the frozen forests of Scandinavia, where a people were about to begin a migration that would change Western civilization forever. This is the story of the Gothic Wars. 300 years of conflict, betrayal, survival, and the slow-motion collapse of the greatest empire the world had ever known. Picture this. It's the year 238 AD, and a Roman patrol on the Danube frontier spots something that makes their blood run cold. Ships, hundreds of ships, packed with warriors whose reputation precedes them like a wave of terror. The Goths have arrived. These aren't the first barbarians Rome has faced, far from it. But these people are different. They're organized, they're disciplined, and they've learned something that no other Germanic tribe has mastered: naval warfare. Within months, Gothic fleets will be sailing through the Bosphorus, raiding cities that haven't seen enemy forces in generations. Roman citizens who'd lived their entire lives in perfect security will wake up to find Gothic warriors in their streets, their homes, their temples. And the world is about to get a lot more dangerous. But who are these Goths, really? Where did they come from? And how did a group of refugees become the force that would bring Rome to its knees? The archaeological evidence points to origins in Scandinavia, specifically southern Sweden and the Danish islands. These early Gothic communities developed sophisticated metalworking, creating weapons and ornamental items that combined brutal functionality with intricate beauty. Their decorative patterns featured interlaced designs and animal motifs that would influence European art for centuries. The Goths weren't just warriors, they were craftsmen, artists, farmers. They had a complex society with strict hierarchies, elaborate religious practices, and a warrior culture that emphasized personal honor above everything else. But around 200 AD, something changed. Maybe the climate shifted, making northern winters unbearable. Maybe population pressure became too intense for the land to support. Maybe they just wanted adventure, wealth, better lives for their children. Whatever the reason, the Goths began moving south. And they didn't move like panicked refugees fleeing disaster. They moved like a nation on the march, entire communities traveling together, warriors protecting farmers, protecting craftsmen, protecting families. They followed the Vistula river system, establishing temporary settlements along its banks as they pushed through territories that would later become Poland. These weren't random migrations. These were organized tribal relocations led by warrior chieftains who maintained strict hierarchical structures within their communities. The Goths traveled with their entire social fabric intact, including skilled metalworkers who could forge weapons and tools, farmers who understood crop cultivation, women who wove textiles and prepared food, children who would become the next generation of warriors and leaders. They brought livestock, cattle, horses, sheep, that provided food, transportation, and wealth. They carried their religious artifacts, their family treasures, their cultural identity. This was a people preserving their way of life while seeking new lands where they could thrive. By 230 AD, they'd reached the Black Sea. The fertile plains north of the Pontus offered everything they needed: grazing land for cattle, access to trade routes, Greek cities ripe for protection money. The Goths looked at this region and saw opportunity. The Roman Empire looked north and saw trouble brewing, and both were absolutely right. The Pontic steppes provided excellent grazing land for Gothic herds, while the proximity to established trade routes allowed Gothic leaders to extract tribute from merchant caravans. and develop economic relationships with Greek cities along the Black Sea coast. These weren't just raiders anymore. They were becoming a regional power, controlling territory, managing resources, building relationships with the civilized world. The Greek cities along the coast found themselves in a difficult position. They could resist and face destruction, or they could accommodate and survive. Most chose accommodation. Gothic warriors would protect Greek merchants in exchange for tribute payments. Greek shipwrights would build vessels for Gothic use. Greek sailors would teach Gothic crews how to navigate the Black Sea and beyond. It was a mutually beneficial arrangement, sort of. The Greeks got to keep their cities and their lives. The Goths got access to maritime technology that would change everything. The first documented Gothic crossing of the Danube frontier occurred in 238 AD, coinciding with the beginning of the crisis of the 3rd century that would plague Rome for the next 50 years. These initial raids were relatively small-scale probing attacks designed to assess Roman military response and identify weaknesses in the frontier defense system. Gothic warbands, typically numbering between 500 and 1,500 warriors, crossed the river at multiple points simultaneously, overwhelming isolated Roman outposts and striking deep into Moesian and Thracian territories before Roman reinforcements could arrive. The Gothic raiders demonstrated remarkable tactical adaptability, combining traditional Germanic fighting methods with techniques learned from contact with Sarmatian and Alan cavalry forces in the Pontic region. Their warriors fought primarily on foot, wielding long spears, single-edged swords called scramasaxes, and round wooden shields reinforced with iron bosses. But they had also incorporated mounted elements into their forces, using horses primarily for mobility rather than shock combat, allowing them to strike quickly and withdraw before Roman legions could engage them in pitched battle. This combination of infantry solidity and cavalry mobility made them incredibly difficult to counter. Roman commanders trained in traditional legion tactics found themselves constantly outmaneuvered by enemies who refused to fight on Roman terms. Roman frontier defenses, designed primarily to counter traditional barbarian raids and small-scale incursions, proved inadequate against coordinated Gothic attacks. The Limitani stationed throughout Thrace possessed neither the numbers nor the training necessary to suppress organized resistance from experienced Gothic warriors fighting on familiar terrain. The province's urban centers, designed for administration and commerce rather than military defense, proved vulnerable to Gothic attacks that could overwhelm local garrisons and capture valuable supplies and equipment. The Goths struck isolated outposts, undefended villages, poorly guarded supply depots. They weren't interested in conquest, not yet. They wanted slaves, livestock, portable wealth, and they developed terrifyingly efficient systems for getting their plunder back across the Danube before Roman counterattacks could materialize. The psychological impact of these early Gothic raids extended far beyond their immediate material damage. Roman civilians in the frontier provinces, accustomed to the security provided by centuries of effective border control, found themselves vulnerable to sudden attacks that could devastate entire communities within hours. The Goths' practice of taking prisoners for slavery created widespread fear among provincial populations who began abandoning exposed settlements and concentrating in fortified towns, disrupting agricultural production and tax collection throughout the affected regions. Imagine you're a Roman farmer living along the Danube. Your father farmed this land. His father farmed this land. For generations, your family has lived in peace, protected by the empire's might. You've heard stories about barbarians, sure, but they were distant threats, problems for soldiers to handle. And then one morning, you're working your fields when you hear screaming from the village. By the time you run back, Gothic warriors are everywhere. They're not killing everyone. That would be wasteful. They're selecting strong men for slave labor, young women for domestic service, or worse, children to be raised as slaves. Your neighbors are being chained together, prepared for the march to slave markets in the north. Your village is burning. Everything you owned, everything your family built over generations, is gone. And this is happening across hundreds of miles of frontier. Gothic success in these land-based operations encouraged them to expand their activities into maritime warfare, a development that would prove even more devastating to Roman interests. The acquisition of ships and naval expertise came through their control of Greek cities along the western Black Sea coast, particularly Tyrus and Olbia, which possessed both vessels and experienced sailors. Rather than simply destroying these communities, Gothic leaders recognized their potential value and incorporated local maritime knowledge into their expanding military capabilities. This wasn't brute force barbarianism. This was strategic thinking. The Goths were learning, adapting, becoming more sophisticated with every campaign. The first major Gothic naval expedition, launched in 255 AD, represented a quantum leap in their operational scope and ambition. A fleet of approximately 500 vessels, ranging from captured Roman warships to converted merchant vessels and locally constructed boats, departed from the mouth of the Dniester River, carrying an estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Gothic warriors. This massive flotilla demonstrated sophisticated logistical planning, as the Goths had arranged supply bases along their intended route and coordinated their naval operations with simultaneous land attacks to prevent Roman forces from concentrating against either threat. Think about what this means. These were people who'd been landlubbers their entire history. Scandinavians, sure, with some seafaring tradition, but the Goths had been land-based for generations. And now they'd assembled a fleet of 500 ships capable of coordinated naval operations across the Black Sea and into the Mediterranean. They'd learned navigation, ship handling, naval tactics. They'd created a logistical system that could keep thousands of warriors supplied during extended campaigns. This wasn't luck. This was organizational genius. The Gothic fleet's passage through the Bosphorus caught Roman authorities completely unprepared. The naval defenses of Constantinople, focused primarily on potential threats from the Mediterranean, offered minimal resistance to this unexpected assault from the Black Sea. Gothic vessels poured through the narrow strait in multiple waves, their crews raising war cries that echoed off the hills surrounding the waterway as they passed the imperial capital itself, demonstrating the complete breakdown of Roman control over this crucial maritime passage. Imagine being a citizen of Constantinople, watching from the walls as hundreds of barbarian ships sail past your city. The Romans weren't supposed to lose control of strategic waterways. That wasn't how the empire worked. Upon entering the Aegean Sea, the Gothic fleet divided into multiple squadrons that struck simultaneously at targets throughout the eastern Mediterranean. The sack of Trebizond showcased Gothic naval capabilities and their ruthless efficiency in amphibious operations. The city's harbour defences, designed to repel traditional naval attacks, proved useless against the Gothic tactic of beaching their vessels directly on accessible shores and launching immediate infantry assaults. Trebizond's wealthy merchant quarter burned for 3 days as Gothic warriors systematically looted warehouses, private homes, and public buildings, loading their ships with gold, silver, precious stones, and high-quality manufactured goods. The destruction was methodical, efficient, terrifying. The Goths had become masters of amphibious assault warfare. They didn't need to defeat harbour defences because they simply went around them. They didn't need siege equipment because they struck so fast that cities couldn't organize effective resistance. The wealth they extracted from these raids was staggering. We're talking about one of the richest trading cities in the Eastern Empire, completely sacked in 3 days. The psychological warfare value of these naval raids became evident in the Goths' approach to Athens in 267 AD. Rather than attempting to storm the city's formidable walls, Gothic forces established a blockade that cut off all supply routes while conducting highly visible raids against surrounding settlements. Athenian citizens watched helplessly as smoke rose from burning villas and farms throughout Attica, while Gothic ships patrolled the coast, intercepting any vessels attempting to bring relief supplies. The city's eventual surrender came not through military defeat, but through the gradual strangulation of its economic lifelines. Athens, the birthplace of democracy, the city of Plato and Aristotle, the intellectual heart of the classical world, brought to its knees by barbarian blockade tactics. Emperor Gallienus, recognizing the inadequacy of traditional Roman military responses to these new Gothic tactics, initiated comprehensive reforms designed to create more flexible and responsive armed forces. His establishment of a central mobile reserve composed primarily of cavalry units recruited from Germanic and Sarmatian allies represented a fundamental shift in Roman military doctrine. These mounted forces could respond rapidly to Gothic incursions, matching their mobility and preventing them from withdrawing unmolested after successful raids. The creation of specialized naval squadrons stationed at key points throughout the eastern Mediterranean formed another crucial element of Gallienus's response to Gothic maritime activities. These flotillas, equipped with purpose-built warships designed for speed and maneuverability rather than traditional ramming tactics, could intercept Gothic vessels before they reached their intended targets. However, the vast extent of the eastern Mediterranean and the Goths' practice of launching simultaneous attacks from multiple directions meant that Roman naval forces remained perpetually overstretched. Gallienus also recognized that purely military solutions would prove insufficient against the Gothic threat and began exploring diplomatic alternatives that might reduce the pressure on Roman frontiers. His negotiations with Gothic leaders involved offers of annual tribute payments, grants of federati status for certain tribes, and permission for limited settlement within Roman territory in exchange for military service. These diplomatic initiatives acknowledged the reality that Rome lacked the military strength to simply drive the Goths back beyond the Danube through force alone. This was revolutionary thinking. Traditional Roman policy had always been defeat the barbarians, push them back, restore the frontier. Gallienus was saying, maybe we can't do that anymore. Maybe we need to work with them instead of against them. The construction of new fortifications along the Danubian frontier under Gallienus's direction incorporated lessons learned from Gothic tactical innovations. Rather than relying solely on linear defenses that could be bypassed or overwhelmed, Roman engineers began building defense in depth with multiple lines of fortifications, strategically positioned strongholds, and improved communication systems that allowed isolated garrisons to summon reinforcements quickly. These fortifications featured higher walls, more sophisticated siege defenses, and provisions for extended sieges that reflected the Goths' growing expertise in assault techniques. But all of these reforms, military, naval, diplomatic, architectural, they were reactions. Rome was responding to Gothic innovation, always one step behind. The initiative had shifted. The Goths weren't just raiders anymore, they were shaping Roman policy, forcing the empire to adapt to their tactics, their strategies, their very existence. Gothic military organization evolved considerably during this period, transforming from loose tribal confederations into more sophisticated military structures capable of sustaining extended campaigns far from their home territories. War leaders emerged who commanded respect across tribal boundaries, creating larger and more effective fighting forces than traditional Germanic military systems had previously supported. These leaders developed standardized tactical doctrines, improved logistical systems, and diplomatic protocols that allowed different Gothic groups to coordinate their activities against Roman targets. The economic impact of Gothic raids extended throughout the Roman Empire as disrupted trade routes and destroyed agricultural areas, created shortages and price increases that affected even distant provinces. The loss of tax revenue from devastated frontier regions forced imperial authorities to increase taxation in unaffected areas, creating resentment and political instability that further weakened Rome's ability to respond effectively to external threats. Gothic success encouraged other barbarian groups to test Roman defences, creating multiple simultaneous crises that stretched imperial resources beyond their limits. But nothing, not military reforms, not diplomatic initiatives, not new fortifications, could have prepared Rome for what came thundering out of the eastern steppes in 370 AD. The Huns had arrived, and they made the Goths look like amateurs. Imagine you're a Gothic warrior. You've spent your whole life hearing about your people's military prowess. Your grandfather raided Roman territories and came back wealthy. Your father fought in the great naval expeditions and earned glory. You've trained with weapons since childhood. You can throw a spear with deadly accuracy. You can fight for hours in shield wall formations. You're part of an elite warrior culture that's terrorized the most powerful empire on earth for over a century. You know you're tough, you know you're dangerous, and then riders appear on the horizon, unlike anything you've ever seen. They're smaller than you, darker than you, dressed in leather and fur that smells of horses and smoke. Their heads are artificially deformed from childhood binding, giving them an alien, terrifying appearance. Their faces are scarred with ritual marks. They speak a language that sounds like nothing you've ever heard. And they carry composite bows that can kill you from distances you didn't think were possible. These are the Huns, and they're about to teach the Goths what real terror feels like. The Hunnic military system represented a quantum leap in steppe warfare technology and organization. Their composite bows, constructed from horn, sinew, and wood, using techniques perfected over centuries of nomadic warfare, could accurately deliver arrows at ranges exceeding 350 meters. That's over 3 football fields. Your Gothic spears and throwing axes are useless at those ranges. Hunnic warriors trained from childhood to shoot accurately while mounted at full gallop, creating mobile artillery platforms that could devastate enemy formations while remaining beyond the reach of conventional weapons. Their horses, bred specifically for endurance and speed rather than size, could cover enormous distances with minimal rest, allowing Hunnic armies to appear suddenly at widely separated locations and disappear before organized resistance could develop. You're fighting ghosts, deadly, terrifyingly efficient ghosts. The initial Hunnic advance westward encountered the easternmost Gothic settlements in the Pontic steppes around 370 AD, catching the Greutungi Confederation completely unprepared for this new form of warfare. The Greutungi, who had established themselves as the dominant power east of the Dniester River following their occupation of former Roman Dacia, possessed military capabilities well suited to conflicts with other Germanic tribes or Roman frontier forces, but proved inadequate against Hunnic tactical innovations. Their heavy infantry formations, armed with long spears and rectangular shields, became easy targets for Hunnic mounted archers who could strike repeatedly without engaging in close combat. It was a mismatch of catastrophic proportions. Gothic infantry trained to fight in shield walls to hold ground. To engage in close combat, they were being cut down by enemies they couldn't even reach. Imagine the frustration, the terror. You're a Gothic warrior. You've trained your whole life for combat. You're brave, you're skilled, and you're utterly helpless against enemies who kill you from distances you can't even comprehend. The Greutungi King Ermanaric, whose reign had witnessed the expansion of Gothic power throughout much of the western Pontic region, commanded a confederation that included not only Gothic tribes but also various Alan, Sarmatian, and Slavic groups that had accepted Gothic overlordship in exchange for protection and participation in profitable raiding expeditions. This diverse coalition had proven effective against Roman frontier defences and rival barbarian groups. But its heterogeneous composition became a liability when facing the Hunnic threat. Different ethnic components of Ermanaric's confederation possessed varying levels of military effectiveness and political loyalty, creating vulnerabilities that Hunnic leaders exploited through targeted attacks and diplomatic subversion. The Huns didn't just defeat the Goths militarily, They broke them politically. They identified the weakest links in the confederation, the allies who were less committed, the tribes who'd only joined for protection or profit, and they either destroyed them or offered them better deals. The Gothic Confederation started falling apart not just from military pressure, but from political disintegration. Ermanaric's attempts to organize coordinated resistance against the Hunnic advance revealed the fundamental limitations of Gothic military organization when confronting highly mobile enemies. Gothic armies, designed for siege warfare and pitched battles against similarly equipped opponents, required extensive logistical support and moved relatively slowly due to their reliance on supply wagons and infantry formations. The Huns' ability to strike simultaneously at multiple locations across hundreds of miles of territory made it impossible for Gothic forces to concentrate effectively or protect all of their settlements and resources. Hunnic raiding parties systematically targeted Gothic livestock herds, agricultural settlements, and supply depots, gradually weakening the Confederation through economic warfare rather than decisive battlefield victories. It was brilliant strategy. Why risk your warriors in pitched battles when you can just destroy your enemy's ability to sustain themselves? The Huns burned fields, slaughtered livestock, poisoned wells. They made Gothic territory uninhabitable. The psychological impact of Hunnic warfare proved as devastating as its material effects on Gothic communities throughout the Pontic region. The Huns' practice of scalping fallen enemies and decorating their weapons and horse gear with human remains created terror among populations that had never encountered such practices. Their distinctive appearance, with artificially deformed skulls created through infant head binding, ritual scarification, and elaborate tattoos, reinforced their fearsome reputation among Gothic warriors who had previously considered themselves the most formidable fighters on the steppes. Hunnic war cries, performed in their incomprehensible Turkic language and accompanied by bone whistles and drums made from human skulls, added to the psychological warfare that preceded their physical attacks. Gothic morale collapsed before the fighting even began. Warriors who'd faced Roman legions without flinching found themselves terrified of an enemy that seemed inhuman, supernatural, unstoppable. The collapse of organized resistance in the eastern Pontic region accelerated as individual Gothic tribes began abandoning their allegiance to Ermanaric in favor of separate negotiations with Hunnic leaders. The Huns demonstrated sophisticated understanding of barbarian political dynamics, offering generous terms to tribes willing to submit voluntarily while devastating those that continued to resist. Gothic communities that accepted Hunnic overlordship retained their internal organization and leadership structures while providing warriors for Hunnic military campaigns and tribute in the form of livestock, weapons, and slaves. This flexible approach to conquered populations allowed the Huns to expand their confederation rapidly while minimizing the administrative burden of governing sedentary agricultural societies. It was empire building at its most efficient. The Huns didn't want to govern the Goths. They wanted to extract resources and military service. So they left existing Gothic leadership in place, demanded tribute and warriors, and moved on. The Gothic elite could maintain their positions, their status, their wealth, as long as they served their new Hunnic masters. For many Gothic nobles, it was an acceptable arrangement, better than death. Ermanaric's death in 375 AD, whether by suicide facing inevitable defeat or assassination by members of his own court who sought to negotiate separate peace agreements with the advancing Huns, marked the definitive end of Greutungi independence and the fragmentation of the Eastern Gothic Confederation. Historical sources provide conflicting accounts of the circumstances surrounding his demise. Some suggest suicide in the face of inevitable defeat, a warrior's death chosen on his own terms. Others describe assassination by members of his own court who sought to negotiate separate peace agreements with the advancing Huns. And the king's advanced age and the overwhelming nature of the Hunnic threat make either explanation plausible, but the immediate consequences proved identical regardless of the specific cause. Without Ermanaric's unifying leadership, the various components of the Grötungi Confederation pursued independent survival strategies that further weakened collective resistance to Hunnic expansion. It was every tribe for itself now. The fragmentation of Gothic power created a massive refugee crisis as populations throughout the Pontic region sought safety from Hunnic attacks. Entire communities abandoned their settlements, loading their possessions onto wagons and driving their livestock herds westward toward territories still under Gothic control, or ultimately toward the Roman frontier. These refugee columns, often numbering in the thousands and stretching for miles along primitive roads, became easy targets for Hunnic raiders who could strike at will against the slow-moving convoys. The breakdown of organized Gothic military protection meant that civilian populations faced constant danger from bandits, rival ethnic groups, and Hunnic war parties seeking slaves and plunder. The Gothic world was collapsing. Everything they'd built over the past century and a half, the power, the wealth, the reputation, was being swept away by a new enemy they couldn't defeat. The Western Gothic Confederation, dominated by the Thervingi under their leader, Athanaric, initially attempted to maintain their territorial integrity through defensive measures designed to prevent Hunnic penetration into their domains. Athanaric ordered the construction of earthwork fortifications along the Dniester River, creating a barrier that he hoped would channel Hunnic attacks toward more defensible positions where Gothic infantry could engage effectively. These defensive works, while impressive in scope, proved inadequate against enemies who possessed the mobility to bypass fixed fortifications entirely and strike at undefended areas behind the main defensive line. The walls were useless, the Huns just rode around them. The failure of Athanaric's defensive strategy became apparent as Hunnic forces demonstrated their ability to cross the Dniester at multiple points simultaneously while maintaining pressure against the main Gothic positions. Hunnic commanders showed no interest in capturing or holding specific territories. Instead, they focused on disrupting Gothic economic activities and political cohesion through constant harassment and the threat of sudden attacks. Gothic farming communities found themselves unable to plant crops or harvest existing fields due to the ever-present danger of Hunnic raids, creating food shortages that weakened civilian morale and military effectiveness. You can't fight if you can't eat. You can't maintain an army if your agricultural base is destroyed. The Huns understood this. They were systematically destroying the Gothic ability to resist. Internal divisions within the Thervingi Confederation intensified as the Hunnic threat grew more severe, and Athanaric's defensive measures proved increasingly ineffective. A significant faction led by Fritigern argued for abandoning attempts to maintain Gothic independence in favor of seeking Roman protection through negotiated settlement within imperial territory. Fritigern's supporters included many of the Gothic nobles who had converted to Arian Christianity during previous diplomatic contacts with Roman officials, creating religious as well as political divisions within the Confederation. These Christian Goths viewed Roman civilization more favorably than their pagan counterparts and possessed existing relationships with imperial administrators that could facilitate successful negotiations. The debate between Athanaric's resistance strategy and Fritigern's accommodation approach reflected broader questions about Gothic identity and survival in the face of overwhelming external pressure. Athanaric represented traditional Gothic values, emphasizing independence, martial honor, and rejection of foreign influence. He believed the Goths should fight, should maintain their freedom, should die if necessary, rather than submit to Roman authority. Fritigern advocated pragmatic acceptance of Roman overlordship as the only viable means of preserving Gothic communities and culture. He argued that survival mattered more than pride, Better to live under Roman rule than die free. This fundamental disagreement about survival strategies created irreconcilable divisions that ultimately split the Thavingi Confederation into competing factions pursuing mutually exclusive policies. The Gothic world wasn't just being destroyed from outside, it was tearing itself apart from within. Fritigern's diplomatic overtures to Emperor Valens began in early 376 AD, as the military situation in the Pontic region continued to deteriorate. The Gothic leader dispatched envoys to Constantinople carrying proposals for large-scale Gothic settlement within Roman territory in exchange for military service and acceptance of imperial authority. These negotiations required delicate handling, as Fritigern needed to demonstrate both the desperation of the Gothic situation and their potential value as Roman allies without appearing so weak as to be dismissed as worthless refugees. The Gothic envoys emphasized their people's military capabilities. These were warriors who'd terrorized Rome for over a century after all, their willingness to accept Christian conversion, and their potential contribution to Roman frontier defense against future barbarian threats. Translation: we're dangerous enough to be useful allies, desperate enough to accept your terms, and Christian enough to be trusted. Maybe. Emperor Valens faced complex strategic calculations in evaluating Fritigern's proposals, as accepting large numbers of Gothic settlers involved significant risks alongside potential benefits. The empire's chronic manpower shortages, particularly acute in the eastern provinces due to ongoing conflicts with Sassanid Persia, made Gothic military service attractive despite concerns about their reliability and long-term loyalty. Valens' advisors debated whether Gothic settlers could be effectively integrated into Roman society or whether their presence would create internal security threats that might prove more dangerous than the external enemies they were intended to counter. Some argued for acceptance. Fresh warriors, experienced fighters, people who knew how to fight the very barbarians threatening Rome's frontiers. Others warned of danger. These were the same Goths who'd been raiding Roman territory for generations. Could they really be trusted? The Roman emperor's decision-making process was complicated by incomplete intelligence about the actual scale of the Hunnic threat and the true extent of Gothic desperation. Imperial officials possessed limited knowledge of steppe politics and warfare, making it difficult to assess whether the Hunnic expansion represented a temporary disruption that might resolve itself or a permanent shift in the balance of power that would continue to generate refugee populations. Valens' military advisors, trained in conventional warfare against organized enemies, struggled to comprehend the implications of nomadic confederation tactics and their potential impact on established frontier defense systems. Preliminary agreements reached between Roman negotiators and Fritigern's representatives established the basic framework for Gothic settlement, while leaving crucial details to be resolved through subsequent discussions. The Goths would be permitted to cross the Danube and establish communities in Thrace under Roman supervision, with their warriors serving as foederati in imperial military campaigns. In exchange, Gothic settlers would accept Roman law, pay taxes, and submit to imperial administrative authority while retaining their internal social organization and cultural practices. The conversion of the Gothic settlers to Christianity, while encouraged, would not be mandatory, though Fritigern's own conversion served as a powerful symbol of Gothic willingness to embrace Roman civilization. It looked good on paper. It looked like a solution that could benefit everyone. The Goths would get safety. Rome would get warriors. Everyone wins. But the gap between agreements on paper and implementation in reality was about to become catastrophically apparent. The logistical challenges involved in facilitating the migration of potentially 200,000 Gothic refugees across the Danube and their subsequent settlement in Thracian territories required extensive preparation by Roman administrators. Provincial officials needed to identify suitable settlement areas, with adequate agricultural potential and water resources, while ensuring that Gothic communities would be sufficiently dispersed to prevent the formation of concentrated populations that might pose security risks. The provision of temporary shelter, food supplies, and basic necessities for the incoming settlers demanded coordination between military and civilian authorities throughout the affected regions. Nobody had ever attempted something on this scale before. Rome had accepted barbarian settlers in the past, sure, but never this many. Never this quickly, never under these circumstances. Roman military commanders responsible for frontier security expressed significant concerns about the practical implementation of the settlement agreements, particularly regarding the supervision and control of Gothic populations during the transition period. The proposed crossing points along the Danube lacked the infrastructure necessary to process large numbers of refugees efficiently, creating opportunities for unauthorized crossings and the potential infiltration of hostile elements among legitimate settlers. The dispersal of Gothic communities throughout Thrace would require ongoing military oversight that would strain already limited garrison forces and potentially compromise frontier defense against other threats. These were valid concerns. These were legitimate worries about security, logistics, administration, but nobody in the Roman government seemed to be taking them seriously enough. Nobody seemed to be preparing adequately for what was about to happen. The approaching winter of 376 AD added urgency to the negotiations as Gothic refugees faced the prospect of surviving the harsh steppe winter without adequate shelter or supplies while under constant threat from Hunnic attacks. Fritigern's envoys emphasized the desperate conditions facing their people, describing the systematic destruction of Gothic settlements and the growing number of refugees seeking protection. The Gothic leader's ability to maintain control over his followers depended largely on his success in securing Roman sanctuary, as failure would likely result in his replacement by leaders advocating different survival strategies or submission to Hunnic overlordship. Time was running out. The harsh winter of 375-376 AD brought unprecedented suffering to Gothic communities scattered across the Pontic steppes as Hunnic pressure intensified and traditional survival mechanisms collapsed under the weight of constant warfare. Snow-covered plains that had once provided winter shelter for Gothic settlements became killing fields where Hunnic raiders struck without warning, their horses' hooves muffled by the frozen ground as they approached sleeping encampments. The combination of military pressure and environmental hardship created conditions that made Fritigern's negotiations with Emperor Valens not merely advantageous but essential for Gothic survival. By early spring 376 AD, Gothic refugees had begun concentrating along the northern banks of the Danube in numbers that strained the capacity of any organized crossing operation. Conservative estimates suggested that between 150,000 and 200,000 Goths sought passage into imperial territory, including approximately 40,000 warriors accompanied by their families, livestock, and portable possessions. This massive population movement represented not merely a military unit seeking employment, but entire communities attempting to preserve their social fabric while escaping existential threats. The refugees included skilled craftsmen whose metalworking and leatherworking expertise would prove valuable, farmers who understood crop cultivation and animal husbandry, merchants who'd maintained trade networks, religious leaders who provided spiritual guidance. This wasn't just an army, this was a nation seeking a new home. The designated crossing point at the fortress of Durostorum presented immediate logistical challenges that Roman officials had underestimated in their preliminary planning. The fortress, designed to accommodate normal frontier traffic and military operations, possessed neither the infrastructure nor the personnel necessary to process thousands of refugees daily while maintaining security protocols. Roman engineers hastily constructed additional pontoon bridges to supplement the existing ferry services, but these improvised facilities proved inadequate for the massive volume of people, animals, and possessions seeking passage across the wide river. The whole operation was chaos from the start. Refugees packed the northern bank, waiting days or weeks for their turn to cross. Temporary camps sprawled for miles without adequate sanitation, without enough food, without proper shelter. Roman administrative procedures developed for handling individual travelers in small groups broke down completely when confronted with the Gothic migration's unprecedented scale. Officials responsible for registering new arrivals, conducting security screenings, and organizing temporary accommodations found themselves overwhelmed by the sheer numbers of refugees requiring processing. The systematic documentation that Roman bureaucracy normally maintained for all border crossings became impossible to implement effectively, creating gaps in record-keeping that would later prove problematic for tax collection and military recruitment purposes. Nobody knew exactly how many Goths were crossing. Nobody knew who they were. Nobody was properly tracking weapons, though the agreements required disarmament. The whole system was breaking down under the weight of numbers nobody had adequately prepared for. The Gothic refugees' condition upon reaching the Danube revealed the devastating impact of their prolonged exposure to Hunnic warfare and winter hardship. Many families had lost livestock, abandoned heavy possessions during their flight, and survived on minimal food supplies for weeks or months before reaching Roman territory. Children showed signs of malnutrition, their faces gaunt, their bodies weakened by hunger and exposure. Elderly refugees struggled with exhaustion and exposure-related illnesses that required immediate medical attention that wasn't available. The Goths' desperation made them willing to accept almost any terms for Roman sanctuary, but it also created humanitarian obligations that strained provincial resources beyond their capacity. These were people at the absolute end of their rope. They'd lost everything, they'd fled for their lives, they'd survived Hunnic attacks, steppe winter, a desperate migration, and now they were at Rome's doorstep, hungry, exhausted, vulnerable, and completely dependent on Roman goodwill. And that's when the corruption started, because of course it did. When you have desperate people with no options and you have officials with power over their fate, and you have inadequate oversight, corruption is inevitable. The corruption and incompetence of Roman officials assigned to manage the Gothic settlement emerged as critical factors in the deterioration of relations between the refugees and imperial authorities. Lupicinus, the military commander responsible for Thracian operations, and Maximus, the provincial administrator, viewed the Gothic migration primarily as an opportunity for personal enrichment rather than a complex humanitarian and strategic challenge requiring careful management. These officials systematically diverted supplies intended for Gothic refugees, selling food and other necessities at inflated prices while pocketing the profits and providing inadequate provisions for the desperate newcomers. Imagine fleeing for your life across hundreds of miles, losing everything you own, arriving at civilization's gates exhausted and starving. And then the Roman officials who'd promised to help you demand bribes for basic food. They forced Gothic families to trade valuable possessions, including weapons and jewelry that had been in their families for generations, for basic foodstuffs at exploitative rates that enriched Roman merchants and administrators while impoverishing the refugees. Some Roman administrators even engaged in slave trading, purchasing Gothic children from desperate families and selling them in established markets throughout the eastern provinces. Parents faced with the choice between watching their children starve or selling them into slavery with the hope they'd at least be fed, made heartbreaking decisions that would haunt them forever. This practice violated both the terms of the settlement agreement and basic standards of human decency. But it happened, repeatedly, systematically, with the full knowledge of Roman authorities who did nothing to stop it. The inadequate food supplies provided to Gothic settlements created immediate hardship and growing resentment among refugees who had expected Roman protection to include basic sustenance for their families. Roman officials had promised adequate provisions during the initial negotiations, but the actual distribution system proved corrupt and insufficient for the massive population requiring support. Gothic families found themselves forced to trade valuable possessions for basic food at exploitative rates. The systematic exploitation of Gothic refugees extended beyond food supplies to encompass all aspects of their interaction with Roman administrative systems. Officials demanded bribes for processing settlement documents, charged excessive fees for temporary accommodations, and created artificial delays in the distribution of promised lands and resources. Overcrowded camps lacking adequate sanitation facilities became breeding grounds for disease, where dysentery and fever spread rapidly through populations weakened by malnutrition. While insufficient food supplies led to increasing desperation among refugees who had expected Roman protection to provide security and sustenance, children were dying, the elderly were dying. Warriors who'd survived Hunnic attacks and winter steppe conditions were watching their families suffer under Roman protection. The Goths' warrior culture, which emphasized honor and reciprocal obligations, made the systematic betrayal of Roman promises particularly offensive and humiliating for men accustomed to respect and fair treatment in their dealings with other peoples. In Gothic culture, when you made an agreement, you honored it. Your word was your bond. Breaking an oath was one of the most shameful things a warrior could do. And here were the Romans who claimed to be civilized, who claimed to represent order and law and justice, systematically breaking every promise they'd made. The deteriorating conditions in Gothic settlements throughout Thrace created a volatile situation that Roman authorities seemed incapable of recognizing or addressing effectively. Overcrowded camps became powder kegs of frustration and rage. Gothic religious practices and cultural traditions faced additional pressure from Roman officials who viewed the refugees' customs with suspicion and hostility. While the settlement agreements had guaranteed religious freedom, local administrators often interfered with Gothic religious ceremonies and attempted to force conversions to Orthodox Christianity through economic pressure and administrative harassment. The Goths' Arian Christian beliefs, shared by many of their leaders including Fritigern, created theological conflicts with Roman Orthodox authorities who viewed Arianism as heretical and dangerous to imperial unity. So even the Christian Goths weren't Christian enough for the Romans. Even those who'd converted, who'd embraced Roman religion, found themselves persecuted for believing the wrong version of Christianity. The breakdown of trust between Gothic refugees and Roman authorities accelerated throughout 376 and early 377 AD as the gap between official promises and actual conditions became increasingly apparent. Gothic leaders who had staked their reputations on successful negotiations with Emperor Valens found themselves unable to deliver the security and prosperity they had promised their followers. Fritigern's position became increasingly precarious. He'd convinced his people to seek Roman protection. He'd argued that accommodation was better than resistance. He'd promised them safety, food, a new home, and instead they were getting systematic abuse, starvation, and betrayal. His credibility was evaporating. His authority was crumbling. The systematic failure of Roman administrative systems to provide adequate support for the refugees created conditions that made violent conflict increasingly likely, as Gothic patience wore thin and alternative solutions appeared increasingly attractive. The Gothic revolt that erupted in 377 AD represented the inevitable consequence of Roman administrative failures and the systematic betrayal of settlement agreements that had brought the refugees into imperial territory. The immediate catalyst occurred during a banquet organized by Lupicinus in Adrianople, where Gothic leaders had been invited to discuss ongoing problems with their community's treatment. The Roman commander attempted to eliminate Gothic leadership through treachery, a plan to arrest or assassinate Fritigern and other chiefs during what was supposed to be a diplomatic dinner. The plan backfired spectacularly when Fritigern and other chiefs escaped the trap and returned to their people with evidence of Roman duplicity and hostile intentions. That was it. The Goths were done negotiating. They'd tried accommodation, they'd accepted humiliation, they'd endured starvation and abuse, and the Romans had just tried to murder their leaders during a peace dinner. Time for war. The Gothic uprising began with coordinated attacks against Roman administrative centers and military installations throughout Thrace as refugee communities abandoned their assigned settlements and coalesced into organized military formations. But these weren't random acts of violence. This was organized military action. The Goths' intimate knowledge of local terrain acquired during their months of residence in the province provided significant advantages in their operations against Roman forces that had become complacent about internal security. Gothic warriors, despite having surrendered many of their weapons during the settlement process, quickly rearmed themselves with captured Roman equipment and weapons hidden during their initial disarmament. Not all the Goths had turned in their weapons. Many had hidden swords, spears, axes, shields, and now those hidden weapons came out. The rapid spread of the Gothic revolt demonstrated the extent of refugee dissatisfaction with Roman treatment and their readiness to risk everything in pursuit of better conditions or revenge for betrayed promises. Gothic communities that had initially remained loyal to the settlement agreements joined the uprising as news spread of Roman treachery and the success of early rebel operations. The revolt's expansion beyond the original Visigothic refugees to include other barbarian groups settled in the region revealed the broader pattern of Roman administrative failure in managing barbarian integration. The alliance between Fritigern's Visigoths and various Ostrogothic groups, Alans and other barbarian peoples created a formidable military coalition that possessed both numerical strength and tactical diversity. The Ostrogoths, led by Alatheus and Saphrax, brought cavalry expertise and knowledge of steppe warfare techniques learned during their conflicts with the Huns. Alan horsemen provided additional mounted capabilities that Roman forces would find devastating. Various smaller tribal groups contributed specialized skills and local knowledge that enhanced the coalition's military effectiveness against Roman forces. This wasn't just a Gothic rebellion anymore. This was a full-scale barbarian uprising involving multiple peoples, tens of thousands of warriors, and a level of coordination that Roman commanders found genuinely frightening. Roman military responses to the Gothic uprising revealed fundamental weaknesses in imperial defensive preparations and the inadequacy of existing forces to counter a major internal rebellion. The Limitane, stationed throughout Thrace, possessed neither the numbers nor the training necessary to suppress organized resistance from experienced Gothic warriors fighting on familiar terrain. These were frontier troops designed to stop small raiding parties, not suppress a massive, well-organized rebellion by experienced warriors. The province's urban centers, designed for administration and commerce rather than military defense, proved vulnerable to Gothic attacks that could overwhelm local garrisons and capture valuable supplies and equipment. City after city fell or found itself besieged. The Goths were winning. Emperor Valens's decision to personally lead imperial forces against the Gothic rebellion reflected both the seriousness of the threat and his confidence in his ability to resolve the crisis through decisive military action. And the emperor assembled a substantial army from units stationed throughout the eastern provinces, including regular legions, auxiliary formations, and allied troops recruited from various barbarian groups still loyal to Roman service. This composite force represented the largest military concentration the Eastern Empire could assemble without completely abandoning other frontier responsibilities. Valens was confident. He had numbers, he had equipment, he had Roman military discipline, he had the best troops the Eastern Empire could field. What could possibly go wrong? The answer, as it turned out, was everything. The approach of Emperor Valens toward Adrianople in August 378 AD marked the culmination of a campaign that had failed to achieve its strategic objectives despite several tactical successes against isolated Gothic forces. But the emperor's army, while substantial in numbers and well equipped by contemporary standards, had been unable to force the Gothic coalition into decisive battle or prevent their continued operations throughout Thrace. Valens faced increasing pressure to achieve a conclusive victory that would restore imperial prestige and eliminate the barbarian threat to the eastern provinces. On August 9, 378 AD, he got his battle. The Battle of Adrianople would prove to be one of the most catastrophic military defeats in Roman history. The battle began with Roman forces attempting to surprise the Gothic coalition's camp, but quickly developed into a complex engagement that exposed fundamental flaws in imperial military doctrine and tactical execution. Emperor Valens, confident in his numerical superiority and the quality of his troops, ordered an immediate attack without waiting for reinforcements from his nephew Gratian's western army, which was just days away. The Roman formation advanced in traditional battle order, with heavy infantry in the center and cavalry on the flanks, expecting to overwhelm Gothic resistance through disciplined assault techniques that had proven effective in previous conflicts. The Gothic defensive position centered on their wagon laager, but extending into the surrounding terrain provided natural obstacles that disrupted Roman attack formations and created opportunities for barbarian counterattacks. Gothic warriors, fighting with the desperation of men defending their families and communities, resisted the Roman assault with unprecedented ferocity. The Roman advance was making progress. The Gothic infantry line was being pushed back. Victory seemed close, and then came the thunder. Gothic cavalry forces, initially absent from the battlefield out foraging, returned at the critical moment to strike the exposed Roman flanks. The timing of this cavalry intervention, whether planned or fortuitous, proved decisive in transforming a difficult defensive action into a devastating victory over the imperial army. Imagine being a Roman legionnaire in that moment. You've been fighting for hours, you're exhausted, your formation is starting to break down, and then you hear it at the rumble of thousands of hooves. You turn and see masses of Gothic and Alan cavalry crashing into your flank. Your neat formations shatter. Your officers are shouting contradictory orders. Men are falling everywhere. The Gothic infantry you were pushing back suddenly counterattacks with renewed fury. You're surrounded, you're dying, and somewhere in the chaos, the Emperor of Rome is dying too. The collapse of Roman resistance at Adrianople occurred with shocking rapidity, as disciplined formations disintegrated under the combined pressure of Gothic infantry resistance and the surprise cavalry attack. Emperor Valens died along with approximately two-thirds of his army, including many senior officers and experienced veterans whose loss would cripple Eastern imperial military capabilities for years to come. This wasn't just a tactical defeat, it was a strategic catastrophe that eliminated the Eastern Empire's primary field force and left vast territories defenseless against barbarian exploitation. The immediate aftermath of Adrianople left the Eastern Roman Empire in a state of unprecedented vulnerability, with its primary field army destroyed and Emperor Valens dead alongside two-thirds of his forces. The Gothic coalition, now reinforced by additional barbarian groups drawn to their spectacular success, controlled vast swaths of Thracian territory, while Roman administrative authority collapsed throughout the region. Urban centers that had served as bastions of imperial control found themselves isolated and besieged, their garrisons inadequate to maintain effective resistance against coordinated barbarian attacks. The selection of Theodosius as Eastern Emperor in January 379 AD represented a calculated gamble by Gratian, who chose a relatively obscure military commander from Hispania rather than one of the more prominent generals available within the existing imperial hierarchy. Theodosius arrived in Constantinople to find the Eastern Empire's military situation far worse than official reports had indicated, with effective Roman control reduced to a few fortified cities, while Gothic forces operated freely throughout the countryside. His initial assessment revealed that traditional military solutions to the barbarian problem had become impossible due to the destruction of experienced units. and the demoralization of surviving forces, and then Theodosius made a revolutionary decision. Instead of trying to defeat the Goths militarily, he would make them Romans, not through conquest, through negotiation, through partnership, through acknowledging the reality that the old Roman world was gone and something new needed to be built from the ashes. The Treaty of 382 AD emerged from prolonged negotiations addressing both immediate security concerns and long-term integration challenges facing Gothic communities within Roman territory. The agreement established the Visigoths as foederati, granting them legal status as allied peoples with specific obligations to provide military service in exchange for settlement rights and imperial protection. Unlike previous barbarian treaties that had typically involved temporary arrangements or limited territorial grants, the 382 agreement created a permanent framework for Gothic integration into Roman society while preserving their distinct cultural identity and traditional leadership structures. For over a decade, the system worked. The Goths settled in Thrace. They provided warriors for imperial campaigns. They defended Roman frontiers. And then Theodosius died in 395 AD, and the delicate balance he'd maintained collapsed. A Gothic leader named Alaric, frustrated with how the new emperors treated his people, led a rebellion that would culminate in the unthinkable. On August 24, 410 AD, Alaric's Goths entered Rome. For 3 days, they systematically sacked the city that had ruled the known world for 8 centuries. The psychological shock reverberated throughout the Mediterranean. Rome had fallen. The eternal city wasn't eternal anymore. The Gothic Wars, 3 centuries of conflict between Rome and the Germanic peoples, had fundamentally reshaped European civilization. The Goths, who'd arrived as desperate refugees fleeing Hunnic terror, had become the rulers of vast territories. The Romans, who'd thought their empire eternal, had learned the hard lesson that nothing lasts forever. The world that emerged from these wars, a world of barbarian kingdoms, religious transformation, and cultural synthesis, would become medieval Europe. The Gothic Wars weren't just about battles and treaties, they were about the death of one world and the birth of another. If you enjoyed this journey through 3 centuries of conflict, survival, and transformation, there's so much more to explore. Subscribe to Colossus of Empires for deep dives into the civilizations, conflicts, and characters that shaped our world.